Welcome back to the NBA 2K16 team selection for my GM mode. We have all 30 NBA teams in a bracket. Each team faces another team in a one-game playoff match to see who becomes my new GM mode team. So we'll, with a spinner, we'll just spin it and see the top wins right there. So the top team in the two moves on to the next round. So I'll reset this. And our first the teams who get buys are Indiana Pacers and Portland Trail Blazers. These are shuffled seeds, so I didn't do them. So we'll start it off here. First matchup is the Boston Celtics versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Let's spin this. Looks like the Boston Celtics are moving on to the second round to face the Indiana Pacers. Our next matchup is the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Chicago Bulls. Looks like the Bulls are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Detroit Pistons versus the Phoenix Suns. Looks like the Suns are moving on to the second round to face the Chicago Bulls. Our next matchup is the Utah Jazz versus the New Orleans Pelicans. Looks like the Pelicans are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Oklahoma City Thunder versus the Dallas Mavericks. Looks like the Mavericks are moving on to the second round to face the Pelicans. Our next matchup is the Denver Nuggets versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Looks like the Denver Nuggets are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the New York Knicks versus the LA Clippers. Looks like the Knicks are moving on to the second round to face the Denver Nuggets. Our next matchup is the Houston Rockets versus the Orlando Magic. Looks like the Orlando Magic are moving on to the second round to face the Portland Trail Blazers. Our next matchup is the LA Lakers versus the Milwaukee Bucks. Looks like the Bucks are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Miami Heat versus the Toronto Raptors, Canada's team. Looks like the Raptors moving on to the second round to face the Milwaukee Bucks. T.O. Our next matchup is the Charlotte Hornets versus the Brooklyn Nets. Looks like the Hornets are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Atlanta Hawks versus the Sacramento Kings, or the Sacramento Queens. Looks like the Queens are moving on to the second round to face the Hornets. Our next matchup is the San Antonio Spurs versus the Philadelphia 76ers. Looks like the Sixers are moving on to the second round. Our last matchup in the first round is the Washington Wizards versus the Golden State Warriors. Steph Curry versus John Wall. Looks like John Wall and the Washington Wizards are moving on to the second round to face the 76ers. So now our first round is complete, and here are our matchups. Our first matchup of the second round is the Indiana Pacers versus the Boston Celtics. Looks like the Pacers are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Chicago Bulls versus the Phoenix Suns. Looks like the Bulls are moving on to the second round to face the Indiana Pacers. Our next matchup is the New Orleans Pelicans versus the Dallas Mavericks. Looks like the Mavs are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Denver Nuggets versus the New York Knicks. Looks like the Knicks are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Portland Trail Blazers versus the Orlando Magic. Looks like the Magic are moving on to the second round. Our next matchup is the Milwaukee Bucks versus the Toronto Raptors. Looks like the Bucks are moving on to the second round to face the Orlando Magic. Our next matchup is the Charlotte Hornets versus the Sacramento Kings. Looks like the Sacramento Kings are moving on to the third round. I've been saying second round the entire time, I mean the third round. And our last matchup of the second round is the Philadelphia 76ers versus the Washington Wizards. Looks like the Wizards are moving on to the third round to face the Sacramento Kings. That was the second round, and here are matchups. Now here's the start of round three. And our first matchup is the Indiana Pacers versus the Chicago Bulls. Looks like the Pacers are moving on to the semifinals. Our next matchup is the Dallas Mavericks versus the New York Knicks. Looks like the Knicks are moving on to the semifinals to face the Indiana Pacers. Our next matchup is Orlando Magic versus the Milwaukee Bucks. Looks like the Magic are moving on to the semifinals. Our last matchup of the third round is the Sacramento Kings versus the Washington Wizards. Looks like the Wizards are moving on to the semifinals to face the Orlando Magic. That was our third round, and our last matchups are the Indiana Pacers and the New York Knicks and the Orlando Magic and the Washington Wizards. One of those four teams will be my GM mode team. But our first matchup is the Pacers versus the Knicks. Looks like the Knicks are moving on to the finals. Who will they face? We'll find out next. Our last matchup of the semifinals is the Orlando Magic versus the Washington Wizards. Looks like the Wizards are moving on to the finals to face the New York Knicks. Now, our last teams are the New York Knicks versus the Washington Wizards. Carmelo Anthony versus John Wall and Bradley Beal. Who will win? We'll find out. One last spin. And it looks like the Washington Wizards will be my NBA 2K16 team for GM mode. We'll have some fun controlling the rosters with John Wall and Bradley Beal in the driver's seat. We'll see if we can continue their success here in the NBA on NBA 2K16. So that was our team selection for NBA 2K16. Make sure to like and subscribe for more and to see the NBA 2K16 My GM mode with the Washington Wizards. And I'll sign off here, so thanks for watching, and I will see you later.